Hello and welcome to the 41st edition of Half Hour, a podcast starring me, John Paul Logidici, as your host. In today's episode, I will discuss German foreign policy after the Russian aggression with Jakub Eberle. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for
really
the invitation,
appreciate it.
John.
Anytime. If you want to just tell the audience a little about yourself, maybe what your educational background is, maybe what you're doing here in Prague, things of this nature.
Yeah, my name is Jakub Eberle, and at the moment I'm employed at two institutions. Mainly, I'm the research director and senior researcher at the Institute of International Relations Prague, which is a research institute in foreign policy, international politics, international affairs, European politics. And apart from that, I'm also assistant professor at the Prague University of Economics and Business. And my area of expertise is mostly Czech and German foreign policy and theory of international relations. As far as my educational background is concerned, I started studying here in Prague at Charles University. I'm from Prague. I'm not from Prague, but I'm just from the outside of Prague. I'm Czech. And then I did most of my studies abroad. I did my master's at the University of St Andrews in Scotland in security studies, and then I continued directly with my PhD at the University of Warwick in England.
What made you kind of want to jump into this field?
The field of broadly, what I do, why I do international politics. I mean, it's kind of difficult to say because it's not that one day, or at least in my case, that you just say, well, this is, these are my options, this is what I want to do. But I was always interested in politics, in history, and then, this kind of just I would say crystallized, made the most sense to me. So interest, I'm doing what I like.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, I think everyone can kind of look up to that. I know that I find it a very interesting topic as well. That's part of the reason why I came to UNIP and decided to pursue international relations, although I was a transfer student before and I was in political science originally. But I could see how these two fields kind of lean into each other.
Yeah.
But it really is something, quite interesting. But
I think there are also different traditions, right? In the US, you would see political science and international relations kind of more as two different disciplines, whereas in Europe, we see them as really being kind of close to each other. And by the way, in my work and in the work of quite a lot of people at the Institute, we are kind of very interdisciplinary. So we don't really stick into boxes that often. So I very often use elements of sociology, social theory, philosophy, theory of language in my work, and it's fairly common also for others.
Okay. I guess we can kind of jump right into the topic if you'd really like to. So German foreign policy after the Russian aggression. One of the first questions I had was, how has Germany changed its foreign policy approach with Russia after the beginning of the invasion? And I'm going to use the specific February 2022 as the invasion.
Yeah, I mean the change has been dramatic, right? The big question that we can perhaps unpack later is if it's been dramatic enough or quick enough. But the change has been it's really been an abrupt U-turn, because before that, even as kind of tensions with Russia, had been mounting, since 2014, the latest, and then gradually with growing hostilities, kind of picking up. Before that, Germany was kind of in the moderate camp. Not because of being kind of, that much kind of necessarily friendly with Russia, or because of, German politicians being, having some admiration of Putin or his regime, not much thereof, but because of kind of a, let's say, more kind of liberal, pragmatic approach to international politics. Okay, we may not like them, right, but the best way is kind of to do business with them, to tie them to us, as closely as possible, because then, we can perhaps exercise some control. So it was a politics of expanding business ties, especially in terms of energy. So for example, the Nord Stream pipelines are the kind of symbolic of that, right? And this changed. Very rapidly after the invasion, as even days before Russia actually went in, full scale, Germans the German government stopped the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, and then after the invasion, the German government first subscribed to the EU sanctions, and then continued to do so, even though perhaps never really being like one of those, pushiest countries on that, but they subscribed to really far-reaching sanctions, and then gradually, even, and that was a bit, there was a bit of hesitation and a lot of criticism, justified to an extent from Eastern Europe or other countries, but then in the end, Germany also became one of the biggest arms provider. So basically, in a nutshell, what we've seen over the last year and a half was a change from Russia's main business partner in Europe, from really a strategic partner, to being a key supplier of war material and political supporter of Ukraine, Russia's enemy in the war of aggression, of course.
From what I was reading, a long time, this is obviously accurate, I can't even dispute that. From what I was reading, Germany was really trying this policy of almost like, two of these large objects, these countries trying to kind of economically interweave themselves, much like how the European Union does it, of course on a much, maybe less broad scale, maybe just in the energy sector. And, it's no secret that a lot of Russians are buying, German cars, and they're going to Russia like so. So I think from what I was reading, Merkel was really trying to keep Russia in and not allow them or make it infeasible for them to act in such a manner. But it really is unfortunate that, the regime in the Kremlin found credence in this action, and was able to actually pull this off. Now, many people speculated that that Germany would kind of remain in this kind of neutral position for a long time, but they've actually really come, full circle, and they've actually pledged a lot of euro to help with the war effort. In a lot of my classes that I had, with, certain professors, we would talk about how the EU is kind of in this process of remilitarizing. Maybe not in a really dramatic sense, but there is some, progress being made. And we were always taught that France was kind of like the military arm, whereas Germany was more of an economic driver in this union. Do you see Germany kind of rearming en masse, like to not only supply Ukraine, but to also kind of fill out its own stockpiles? I know that they're designing tanks, they're sending like ammunition, helmets of all kinds. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yes. I mean, first of all, what you said is, at least in my books, a pretty fair estimate of the logic of Germany's relationship to Russia, and it only should be said that this went well beyond Merkel. This is actually something that started already in the 1970s, already during the Cold War. In the 1970s, the first pipelines were actually built. So this was this is a departure not only from Merkel's foreign policy, but this is really a departure of a foreign policy that was in place for 50 years at least.
Mm-hmm.
With the remilitarization, that is indeed the kind of big thing that is happening, and that I think really is game changing, because Germany, whilst being very strong economically and politically, has never been a real military power, right? Since the war, it had a very strong military during the Cold War because of being a frontline state.
Mm-hmm.
So it had all these tanks that it then sold in the 1990s because it didn't need them anymore, but never really wanted to or felt like using or even developed a military that could be used for power projection. So this kind of idea that you have a military so that you can kind of wave it along and use it to coerce others to get your deals. That was kind of like very much at odds with, so to say, the state philosophy of the post-war German state. And that is indeed changing. It's changing, but you can't just change things like that just overnight, not in a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be said that Germany is an extremely complex political system. It's similar to the US in the sense that it's a federation.
Mm-hmm.
So you have very powerful federal actors on the state level.
Okay.
And at the same time, unlike the US, it has a very complicated process of coalition governments.
Mm-hmm.
So in Germany, sometimes a lot of the frustration coming in about Germany being too slow, unlike, the US, but France also, where the president, is often calling the shots, comes from the fact that in Germany you always have a lot of people around the table and in the process who need to make the decisions. So the change is coming, definitely. The money has been pledged. Germany finally, at least, subscribing to fulfilling its 2% of GDP on defense, NATO criteria. Some deals have been kind of announced and put into motion, which would be really, dramatic. For example, Germany now wants to buy the F-35 US planes, which is a massive deal. Germany is, of course, developing its own technology, the Leopard tanks, the new version thereof, and also sorts of things like that. So this is coming. What is not yet clear is how exactly Germany wants to then use this military, what the kind of strategy is going to be. There's a lot of talk about, perhaps putting more German troops in Eastern Europe. For example, they are in Lithuania, not to confuse the two. In Slovakia, there is a lot of ideas that they could be posted also elsewhere. The Germans are fairly, conflicted about that.
Mm-hmm.
Germany was supposed to adopt a new national security strategy. The first official document, it is never had it. Already a few months ago. Now is due to publish it, within a few weeks or months. No one really knows, so we'll see more from that. So there are profound changes. Sometimes they take a lot of time.
Do you think that, in short, that Germany itself, but also these states to its east that aren't Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, do you think that they would be comfortable housing German troops? Given even though the history was now it's a fairly long time ago, but I feel like it's still recent enough for even some of these leaders to hold some reservations about having German units stationed in their country. I know a lot of countries like Poland and even the Czech Republic and Slovakia to a lesser extent kind of want or welcome more U.S. presence. But although Germany is like a neighboring state and it would make more sense, in my opinion, for them to kind of help out there more even, do you think that's ever going to change?
I think it's, first of all, it's changing. For example, you mentioned Slovakia, and Slovakia already hosts German troops and German systems that came in.
Oh, okay.
Came in when the war started. So Germans were part of the donation of the Patriot systems in exchange of Slovakia donating early on its own anti-aircraft systems to Ukraine, the kind of old Soviet stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They also put on a multinational unit under the Czech leadership, consisting also of Germans. So there are, we're not talking about thousands of troops, of course not, but there are already German soldiers present in Slovakia. They are already present since 2015 or 16. It was put in motion after 2014. So since then they've been present in Latvia. So they, as part of the multinational presence. So they are already there. I think some of them are in Romania, but I'm not 100% sure about that. So this is happening. But then it also depends on the individual countries. I don't think that there is a strong sentiment that would still kind of go back to the kind of Second World War kind of issue. So I think the idea, we don't want Germans here because their ancestors committed atrocities here 70 years ago. I think that's not really working because the countries in the region are not worried of Germany. They're worried of Russia. But then there are different cases, right? For example, I think that Poland would be quite hesitant, but because of its own prestige reasons, because Poland is becoming a great military power. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps in some ways perhaps more kind of capable than Germany. So that would be a prestige thing. Some of those are actively calling for that. With Latvia, there is actually this public spat that they signed an agreement with Germany after the war started that Germany would redouble its presence in the country, and since then they've been arguing on what exactly that means. With Lithuania actually wanting to actually have more German soldiers in there than Germany would kind of necessarily want to, because the logic of this is actually less of a, or it's not always the logic of hey Germans, you are our friends. It's very often a very kind of pragmatic, strategic sort of a blackmail logic. It's as long as you have your soldiers here, you can't just abandon us.
Yeah.
So that's the logic. So it's actually, the logic of having German or any other West European, there are also, British soldiers in the Baltic states, and other countries. It's more about, we have UN, so that in case, first of all, to deter Russia from doing something stupid, and then, if Russia does that,
they would be affected as well.
Yes, you are here as well.
Yeah.
It's called tripwire deterrence. So the idea is that, like, if you have, German, British, Canadian, US soldiers on the border, then once, if there had ever been shooting, then these countries are in, and they can't just say, oh, too bad, but it's not really our problem.
This brings a whole new dimension to Article 5, now that you have me thinking about it, because the NATO treaty basically stipulates that if one member is attacked, all of them will come to the defense of this person, or this nation, that's attacked. Now, given his example, if Lithuania is attacked and you have French, German, and British units stationed there, and their soldiers die, people are going to want answers in these countries too, and ultimately that might lead to a wider conflict where Lithuania is supported. So that actually is very, very ingenious in a way.
No, because this follows the logic that actually, since the Baltic states have been admitted to NATO in 2004, actually 2004. Yeah, basically there was this political admission, but NATO for a long time never designed any military plans how to really defend them, because the idea was basically, Russia is not really a threat, right? Which, looking at the war from 2005, let's say, made some sense, right? So let's not provoke Russia by drawing these plans. Let's not provoke Russia by actually, doing military drills here and all of that. So these states were, like, with the growing authoritarianism and especially aggressiveness of the Putin regime since, let's say, 2007, 2008, they've been increasingly anxious, because they were like, well, we're NATO, but, should we trust the Article 5? Because that's been, like, the million-dollar question of NATO since its inception.
Yeah, like, will Article 5 work?
Yeah. How much should we trust it, right? Will the Americans really come? So this is part of this idea that you need to kind of, like, make the attack costly, not overly for the Russians, because then they're not shooting at the Estonians, Lithuanians, but they're shooting at the Germans, the Brits, the Americans, but also then make it costly for the Brits, the Americans, the Germans, to enough so that they need to be in.
Yeah.
So they just don't say, well, whatever, it's too bad, Estonia, but we have other issues to deal with. So that's the logic of this. And hence, coming to your question, that's why most Central and East European states would actually want German, but also other boots on the ground as a guarantee.
No, it makes sense. So I guess another question would be, like, you mentioned earlier about how Slovakia kind of gave its missile systems to Ukraine, and Germany kind of gave them, more updated systems in, like, a donation framework. But my general question is, in addition, what else has Germany done to kind of coagulate its neighbors, to the east and in Central Europe, to kind of help Ukraine more? And how is this working with the fact that a lot of EU countries have put money in, but it has not really been, like, enough,
Putting money in Ukraine, you mean, or where? Yeah, I mean, this is a very kind of complex issue. There's a lot of what was going on, right? So in the first phase of the war, Germany was very reluctant to send first any weaponry to Ukraine, even to allow actually other states to send German-made weaponry, because the regulation is that if you're selling arms, the original manufacturer needs to, or the country of where the original manufacturer resides, needs to sign off on any kind of resale. So first Germany was like, and that was like, until the beginning of the war, was blocking even Estonian attempts to send off some old, original German weaponry. So that was really frustrating. Then Germany said, well, yes, we'll do something, we allow this stuff, and we sent a little bit of ours. But then for a long time, and that I think was the kind of lowest point in German foreign policy, which was April, May last year,
Yeah.
where there was this debate about, oh, do we send heavy weaponry? Because first what went in were basically light weapons, anti-tank weapons, the stuff that kind of stopped the Russians, on the highway to Kiev, But then the question was, okay, if we are to fight back, we need to have much better goodies. We need to have the artillery. We need to have potentially tanks. We need to have jets, because that's what you need to do. And Germany was for a long time like the big laggard on this, and that was like really frustrating for a lot of states. So one thing that they tried to kind of relieve this was this kind of exchange program with multiple states, including Czechia actually, where they basically said, you know what, you guys, you have your old Soviet tanks, you send them to Ukraine, and we'll send you for free, in exchange, our own tanks. So that's what happened, for example, in Czechia. So we have since the last year, they're coming gradually, but we have 14 or 15 Leopard tanks in exchange for old Soviet stuff. They did this with, I don't know about the implementation, but they had these agreements with Greece, with Slovenia, with Poland. The Poles very often kind of, scoffed at that because, what was coming from Germany was not supposed to be quick and good enough. But this was this kind of idea. But then Germany moved to deliver arms directly, increasingly with, ever more goodies, always a little bit slower than the others. But right now, Germany is basically one of the biggest arms supplier of Ukraine, and with some of the really important stuff, especially the tanks. So they already delivered some of the Leopard 2. They promised to deliver some of the older tanks, the Leopard 1, in really high numbers. They delivered quite a lot of artillery, a lot of anti-aircraft systems. So in terms of what Germans are delivering right now to Ukraine, the Ukrainian army and the politicians are very happy about that. They are or were very, very unhappy that it took so long to get it there, so long to basically turn the German government to go kind of full in on these, or almost full in on these things, which obviously, cost Ukraine from their perspective, unnecessary amount of lives, and losses, and all of that. So hope that puts some
No,
some
it does. It does. It's just interesting because Germany's industry for war or for military has been so kneecapped, in really most of modern history now after World War II, and now everything's kind of changing. Japan is also rearming, and they're kind of strengthening out in the East. I know they're not the subject of this podcast, but things are definitely changing in the sense that Germany, as well as Japan, but Germany really, I think, is going to gain many competencies in the next 10 or 20 years for really supplying and arming, European states between them and Russia. Their industry is massive, but I know that their defense industry is only going to grow now. But to the extent that it's going to grow is where I'm not sure. I don't know if it's going to be much like they're going to be a real powerhouse in Europe again, or are they going to remain kind of more of a second rate?
They already were a powerhouse because Germany was one of the biggest arms exporters. It wasn't the European countries that were buying that because they were not rearming. But actually, globally speaking, the world has been, remilitarizing for some 10 to 15 years now. Mm-hmm. But especially the Middle East powers, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Emirati, Egypt, Algeria, all those states, really being big consumers of Western arms supplies since the Arab Spring, where basically a lot of them went really big into rearming themselves, and all of them wanted the best technology. And Germany is widely credited to have some of the biggest and best tanks and other armed vehicles. So this is generally what Germany does really, really well. To an extent, submarines, ships, but especially tanks and that kind of similar stuff is really, really big. And they made huge deals with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with the Emiratis, with countries like that already in the last decade. But what is changing is that the kind of speed of rearmament and the scale of that is kind of in demand right now is on a very different scale. So they were already one of the best in the world, but now the scale means that they need to completely redo and kind of upscale the production, because especially the maintenance Because, I mean, what you were doing is that you were making, let's say, tanks, but they did not really fight. Because they were like, bought by countries that wanted them to deter others, for prestige and all of that, to do drills. Because what we know, again, what we've been reminded in Ukraine is that, like, once you go into fighting, the losses of the weaponry, of the ammo and all of that are really giant.
Yeah, it's staggering.
Reparations, all the kind of supply chains. So this is what is not in place and what all the big companies are now doing to upscale again.
Mm-hmm. And what I think has happened is, people made many speculations about the war. I myself thought it was going to be over pretty quickly. I thought the Russians were going to go in and just, take out this country within a month, but that didn't happen, thankfully. So, you see footage on the ground of, it looks like World War I. They're in trenches, people are dug in. The Russians have constructed, lines of trenches behind the occupied territory that they have now. And it makes you think, like, this war is, with all the technology that we have even today, the U.S. can tell Ukraine when they're moving their units around, via satellite. Even with all this technology, it's almost like the war is being fought like a war 100 and something years ago, and it really is something to behold, in this way, in terms of, like, military combat and offensive capabilities. It's just interesting that you're not seeing, like, the blitzkrieg of the Second World War. I mean, Russia tried something like that with Kiev, but they failed. But to kind of move to, like, one of my last questions here, I wanted to ask a little about, Germany is dependent on, resources from abroad, whether that be energy or, certain metals. The U.S. is very dependent on rare earth metals. We have a lot of things in the U.S., like, resources-wise. So a lot of these were being bought in Russia before the war. What countries has Germany largely partnered with, now that they can't get certain things, especially the energy, but I know that there's other things that they were getting from Russia. Which countries have they decided to partner with?
Germany has always been, and that's been one of the big issues of, like, the big kind of German geopolitics since the 19th century. Very little resources, very little natural resources. You have the industry, but the resources are not there to scale it up. So this is a long-standing problem, right? And kind of the partnership with Russia that you spoke about earlier was kind of, it seemed as kind of the silver bullet to this, because Russia has all the resources,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the idea that basically the Germans, will get them from Russia for reasonable prices. Russia was not, like, selling for that expensive amount of time.
And they're quite close, geographically in this way.
They're close, and at the time when Russia was more open to the West, they were also keen to actually buy the German technology, to invite in German companies. So in the 1990s, early 2000s, this felt like a perfect match, right? But like you said, this all went, catastrophically collapsed in February last year, and Germany has done a lot in terms of energy to actually, become independent on Russia. Because already, I think, beginning of this year, Germany kind of proudly announced that they are zero dependent on Russia's fossil fuels, which is a big step.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with those fossil fuels, when we're talking about the three of those, right, obviously coal, oil, and natural gas, then it's a different story. Natural gas is most problematic because, there is not kind of a very kind of liquid and free market. You had to have the pipeline before that.
The LNG, yeah.
Yes. So what they're doing is that they're building LNG. So they first of all, they're getting it from other resources where they can via the remaining pipelines. So Norway, the Netherlands. So Norway and the Netherlands, where you actually still have some pipelines that supply natural gas, actually are on, like, for decades unseen levels of export to Germany and Europe more largely, and then the liquefied natural gas terminals. And Germany has really scrambled to secure deals wherever they can.
Mm-hmm.
The US, of course, the US being very big supplier, and then in the Gulf. So, for example, Qatar, because Qatar is a major player in natural gas
Mm-hmm.
and LNG. So so you could see German politicians really queuing, to go to Qatar in the first month after to secure some deals. In terms of oil and coal, these are kind of more kind of freer and more liquid market, so they buy pretty much anything that is there. So with oil, it's obviously from the Gulf countries, from the U.S. as well. But you buy wherever you can with that.
What about like more like raw materials, like maybe metals or I don't know why I'm thinking timber. Like they could probably get that from Finland or something, but like things of this nature.
I don't know terribly much about that, but I know it's a big concern. There's a big issue that, like, one thing where the war is seen more as a kind of a first kind of an example of things to come, is so that you really need to diversify. Because another thing that pops up is China, upon which Germany is economically much more dependent than on Russia. Russia was an energy dependence, and it's still, as far as I know, rare metals, rare earths kind of dependence. But with China, it's pretty much anything. So they're trying to diversify, but it's very difficult, because basically the whole economic model is based on we import whatever we can. We have the industries, we outsource the cheap yet qualified labor to Central Europe, to countries like Czechia, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, and then our industries cash the added value for selling this stuff globally, China, the US, and other markets. And this is obviously, now this whole model was based on the kind of 1990s version of liberal globalization, which is, coming to an end.
Yeah, I know, that's definitely clear. I can't disagree with you there. I mean, you take a look at what China's trying to do by building their pipelines across Central Asia, the railroads, the infrastructure projects. They have a major port in Gwadar, Pakistan now. My understanding is that China wants a much more solid supply of oil that they can get that goes around the Malacca Strait to ensure that they can basically get oil whenever they need to get it. I know Russia's also shifting in that direction as well to try and sell oil to China now that the European market is not so hot for them. We're getting close to the end here. I don't know if you want to leave anything for the audience, like maybe one last statement or, something you foresee coming or anything you feel comfortable with.
I think that, like, if you look at the kind of development of Germany's policies in respect to the war in Ukraine, a lot of the criticism that kept coming for being too little too late, I think was perfectly justified, especially seen from the outside. In the large scheme of things, and looking from now, I think that Germany has perhaps undergone more transformation than any other European country with respect to this. So these are really sea changes. At the same time, Germany really moves very, very slowly. It gets there, but the politics is super complicated. So I think it's good to bear in mind before indulging, in superficial criticisms about, being corrupted by Russian oil or being crippled by historical traumas.
Okay, and with that, I have to say thank you very much for coming on the show. Again,
Thanks.
I really appreciate it. Guys, watch out for 42, and cheers.